Hey, good morning, folks. Pastor Stephen back again with another No Frills daily devotional. And today's topic is feasting on faithfulness. And I will try to explain what I mean by that as this episode plays out. Now, I hope you've been tracking with me, okay? Because in a previous episode titled Fault Lines, I want to kind of pick up on that conversation again today, all right? And I'm trying not to repeat myself too much, but this is a big topic in my brain right now. And so in that episode, we were talking about fault lines, okay? Experiences in our life that we might be holding against God, okay? And it might not be like super overt to you, okay? Where maybe you don't realize that you have been holding this experience against God, okay? And so we're trying to uncover that and trying to heal that kind of thinking in our mind, and it got me on this idea of, well, Stephen, how do we remove fault lines? And I kind of talked a little bit about it in that previous episode about remembering what God has done and then asking him to reveal where he was in those moments. Okay. And so I encourage you to check that out because that episode is going to kind of play into this episode. But it got me still thinking about these fault lines and what in the world is a fault line, right? In the physical world, right? A fault line is this mark in the earth, okay, a crack in the tectonic plates, okay, where there is a potential for an earthquake. Is a potential for destruction. Think about it like a crack in the foundation of a house, right? That crack, when you are looking for a house, if you come across a house and you see big cracks in the foundation, don't buy that house, okay? Because that is potential for disaster. And a lot of times for us as believers, we have these cracks in our foundation, our foundational beliefs of God that they carry a potential for destruction. That's why I think a lot of times we see Christians fall away or turn their backs on God. It's because these cracks that have been existing below the surface of their lives never got addressed, okay? And so I want to encourage myself and you to look for these cracks and see if we can't get these things fixed or healed or removed, or as my wife told me yesterday, let's get them so they're not fault lines anymore, but let's try to convert them into faith lines, because those marks are moments that are going to start to identify your journey away from God. Okay, and that's why it's important to find these cracks, to find these fault lines, and remove them. Okay, so that we can get back on our journey toward God. All right. And so step one that I tried to tease out yesterday in this idea of how to remove fault lines was you got to remember what God has done. And I want to take you to a passage that popped into my brain yesterday. It's Psalm 23. And this is a very famous psalm of David. It starts like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole psalm to you, but I'm going to read about half of it to you. But that's okay, because it's only like 6 verses long. All right, and so I want to read verses 4, 5, and 6 to you today. All right, and David writes this, okay? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Man, I love what David is writing about here, okay? But I want to kind of talk about it and try to clarify, right? This idea of, how do I remove fault lines? Because it's important that we do that, okay? Because those cracks, those fault lines are destined for destruction, okay? And so we've gotta realize that one of the keys to removing those fault lines is filling up on God's faithfulness. Okay, let me show you that in this passage again. Okay, so David wrote in verse 5, "You prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies." Okay, you prepare a table for me, right? A table. Think about what a table is representing here. It's representing food, right? Sitting down and eating in the presence of enemies surrounding me. And what David's trying to hit at here is this idea of we got to consume evidence of God's faithfulness. I want to feast on his faithfulness. I want to remember all the good that he's done for me, okay? In the midst of enemies surrounding me, in the midst of everything that is going on around me, I want to make sure that I am filling up on God's goodness. We're called to be filled with God's faithfulness, but we're also called to be filled with his presence. Think about the second part of verse 5 there. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. And in the Old Testament, oil is often a symbol for God's presence, okay, or God's Holy Spirit, okay? And so what David is saying here, we got to be filled with God's presence to the point of overflowing, okay? Think about a cup sitting on a table and you're just pouring water into it until water starts coming out, but you don't stop pouring, you keep pouring. And so we got to be filled with God's faithfulness. We got to be filled with his presence because we are going to be surrounded, okay? We're going to be surrounded by bad things in this life. Okay, that's what the world has to offer us, bad things. And so we are going to be surrounded by bad things. But here's the deal. We can be surrounded by those bad things, but we're called to be filled with God's goodness and God's presence so that what we're surrounded by doesn't affect what is going on within us, right? Think about, I used this passage earlier. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16. Paul's kind of writing on this same concept. He says, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. It doesn't matter what's going on around you. What really matters is what's going on within you. So get filled with God's faithfulness. Get filled with God's presence so that when you're surrounded by darkness, you can be filled with light. So that when you're surrounded by chaos, you can be filled with peace. So that when you're surrounded by death, you can be filled with life. What's going on around you has nothing to do with what's going on within you if you're filling up on God's faithfulness and filling up on his presence. Hey, you guys, have an awesome, awesome day. Be blessed.